Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Iconoclast stream. We're joined here by PanamaHat and Alexander Adams.
Hello.
Good evening.
So tonight, I think we wanted to cover off something that's obviously been going on in the UK and in America for the last couple of weeks. This kind of wave of destruction of art, mainly in the form of the tearing down of sculptures. And Alex covers off quite a few of these discussion points in a number of his articles. And so we thought it'd be a great idea to get together and just to chat about what's happening, what the consequences of this could be for the future. And and just to kind of explore the area a little bit more. But before we go into it, I thought if we did just do a quick introduction. So Alex, do you want to just say hello to everyone?
Okay, well, hello everyone. First of all, going to pimp up Pharaoh's channel. If you haven't already seen his videos, I've seen the first 3 videos. I don't know if you've made more than that, but first 3 were really cracking videos about art history and very concise and lucid. And I'd urge everyone to check them out. They're very good. So, no. I mean, honestly, I mean, if I was teaching art history at university, I'd be recommending those videos to the students. Very clear. So my name's Alexander Adams. I'm British. I studied art and art history in Goldsmiths, kind of ground zero for political correctness back in the 90s. I'm an artist, poet and critic. I write for The Jackdaw, The Critic, various specialist art publications. You can also find my essays on Spiked. I've written 3 essays on Iconoclasm for Spiked in the last week. 2 of them have been published. The 3rd one is coming out later this week. You can also find my writings and links to my articles and interviews on my website, www.AlexanderAdamsArt.wordpress.com. You can also find me on Twitter at AdamsArtist, I think it is. Yeah. Anyway, so that's me.
Great, Panama.
Well, I'm PanamaHat. I have no formal training in art. I didn't study it at university, but I'm quite widely read in the subject. And in general, I think I'm going to be more use talking about the last few weeks politically in terms of art rather than on kind of art as a topic objectively. Although I have been reading a lot about iconoclasm recently because I was kind of spurred on to by what's been happening. So if you want to check out my channel, there will be content related to art and art history coming up in the next few weeks. But in general, it's not my main focus, basically.
Okay, great. So let's kickstart by looking at the first kind of area, and I think I just wanted to do a bit of a recap as to what's been going on. I think there's so much stuff that's been happening, so many videos that are out there that I think sometimes we can lose track of what's been happening. So I think we're just looking in broadly at iconoclasm in the UK. Where are we at right now? And what I thought just kickstart off is with maybe a bit of a timeline for some of those kind of key moments that I've seen happen. So obviously this is all kind of off the back of the Black Lives Matter protests in America. But I think what's interesting was pretty quickly, just a couple of weeks beyond the initial American protests, smaller protests started to break out across the UK, and they swiftly morphed into discussions around decolonization, around slavery, and from that they became increasingly disruptive, let's just say, and I guess the first major point was on the 5th of June, where we had the protesters spraying a cab on that memorial to Earl Haig, and also the pulling down of the Edward Colston statue on June the 7th. So guys, I just wanted to ask, what was your kind of initial thoughts on, what was going on? How did you hear about it? What was your kind of initial reaction to it? Alex, do you want to go first?
Yeah, well, I have a personal connection because I actually live in Bristol. So I knew that statue pretty well. I walked past it every day. So I did kind of take it a little bit personally. I was opposed to it coming down. I'm opposed to all statues coming down through mob violence. I think there's certainly a discussion to be had about contextualization, but I'm against the taking down of statues generally because I see this not as an isolated incident, but as part of a general trend, which is towards the removal of any statues or symbols which might be considered related to slavery or racism or colonialism or militarism or the police, or, well, the list goes on, because this is not going to end here. And I would say to anyone who thought, well, I'm kind of glad that statue went because he was a slave trader and he was a nasty piece of work. Not that anyone knew anything about him until the day it happened. I would say you do realize that this is going to spread to everywhere. This is going to spread wider and wider. What we've got a denunciation society. So the only way you can keep your position in a denunciation society is by denouncing other people. So it will be more statues, it will be more books, it will be television series, it will be art, it will be changing names, and it will expand wider and wider. And while you think it's kind of useful because it's getting rid of people you don't like at the moment, it will expand to stuff that you love, to stuff that you hold dear, and it will in time come to you personally. So I would say, don't start this sort of campaign of purity, because you may think you're pure, but you're never going to be pure enough. So it will come for you, and it will come for the things you love. So don't start it.
Yeah, I think there's some really interesting points that we'll pull out in a second. Panama, how did you first hear about some of the statues coming down?
Well, obviously it was when I first heard about the Colston statue, the day it happened, I was filled with this kind of dread, because I knew that it wouldn't be the last to come down in the protests, because once that happened, it was kind of like a benchmark for just what these mobs were willing to do. And I think it's, for me, I'm somebody who finds kind of anything to do with a mob, even if it's a mob I agree with, I find it very distasteful and almost kind of nauseous. And to see all these people, tearing down, attacking statues, and then to realize that these people don't know anything about that period. They don't really know who these people were, which was exemplified in the Cathy Newman interview with an activist who, you might have seen it, when asked about Churchill, she said she didn't know him personally. And it's just that kind of disgust that there's no proper authority stopping these kind of mobbish actions. And the idea, and then you have the kind of bitter realization that even the so-called liberals who disagree with the pulling down of statues, so many of them are convinced that that'll be it. They'll just pull down the statue of the slave traders. They'll just pull down the ones that maybe they were, maybe they deserve to be pulled down, that sort of thing. What they don't realize is you cannot satiate mobs like the ones that we've been seeing. They might fizzle out on their own accord, but they will continue to do damage unless stopped.
Yeah, I think you've both brought up something really interesting in regards to the kind of knowledge and understanding about the statues. And you're right with that woman talking about Churchill. I saw at the Rhodes protest, some guy who was hanging around the edge was questioned, do you even know who this guy is? And he was like, oh, I don't know. I just know that he's a bad man. And I think that's one of the interesting narratives around this whole story, is that essentially the mob has been given a list of people who they're the bad men, they must be removed, but not really understanding about who they are or who their lives are. you see that as a problem at all, Alex? At all? Do you feel like is it okay just to say, this guy's involved in slavery? You talked about not necessarily being opposed to removing statues. Do we need to know about these people to realize they're bad people?
Well, I think what you get is you have the background. People have been set up to have a particular attitude. They've been taught in schools, in universities, and by the mainstream media that British history is irredeemably evil. It's founded on the evil pillars of Christianity, capitalism, colonialism, and patriarchy. And people have been set up to feel that, well, all of what happened in the past was set up unjustly. And so therefore, you can attack it from any angle and you can take any target. Now, the reason particular statues are being targeted is because there are certain activists who've just sort of passed these around. For example, the Colston statue in Bristol, I know that the council and the mayor have been wanting to get rid of that statue for ages. And what actually happened was that when the mob formed, the police were told to stand back I believe by the mayor, and they allowed it to go ahead because they had been directed. So basically, the mob was actually more or less following the directions of the council, the mayor, the MPs. I imagine, I haven't heard from the MPs, but I guess they're behind it, and also the senior police officers. So so it happened with the collaboration of the authorities.
I think what's interesting about that is obviously we've got a national, so-called conservative government, and then a lot of these local individual councils who are owned, who are Labour controlled, and like you said, it's really these local councils using their local power to get what they want that they can't push through the legal channels. And I think one of the concerns that I have for all of this is that it's if they can basically legalize this, but by not arresting the people involved, they are kind of legalizing this kind of behavior, which is obviously it's already a green light to other people in different areas to take down statues. But also, in a more general sense, is this how power is going to be used locally going in the future, where if a party in power at a local level cannot get some stuff through the council or through democratic means, can they harness the mob or whip up a mob to do their will for them?
Yes, I would say yes. Yeah, I think what it does is one of the dangerous things is that you've got sort of you have various sort of people say, oh, I understand their emotion, I understand their passion. Well, yeah, but the point of the rule of law is that it's to stop people acting on emotion. It's to stop violence being prompted by emotion. Because, what happens when a mob decides they want to burn down a house or a library, or they want to beat up someone? And with Antifa, you can say, going back to sort of 2016, you had this meme of punch a Nazi, and that was basically because I dislike the supposed political views of someone who I may or may not know, I have the right to attack them, and that this is just simply an extension of that. And the point of having the rule of law is that it stops people acting violently on impulse, and I see it very much linked to the way it seems very patronizing, because it's also related to the way the attackers in the Charlie Hebdo case were treated. It was a case of, oh, well, they were so passionate about it. Their religion had been so mocked and so insulted that they just couldn't help themselves. They just responded automatically, as though they were children, as though they had less self-control than everyone else. And I feel that once you start applying that to mobs in general, which you feel politically sympathetic towards, I think it goes down a bad road.
Panama, how do you feel like? Do you feel like the mob's been mobilised in that kind of way, or is it more like a? Yeah,
I think the mobilisation of the mob has been the consequence of about sort of 20 or 30 years, depending on your opinion, of essentially conditioning to make people believe that, first of all, racism is an unambiguous bad, and secondly, that anybody who disagrees with the line set by university academics and cultural kind of strongholds is a racist. So that combination of thought leads to acts like this. And something I'd like to bring up more related to history and the history of art is that I think we're seeing an obsession with the present in a kind of in a way that's quite eerily unhuman-like. I think what we're seeing is people so convinced that we're so close to a kind of perfectible present society that we can create this this society where utopia is only one punched racist away, or it's only one statue of a slave trader away, perhaps.
Yeah.
And they've no concept that people in the past and people in the future have different views to us, and that our views are not objectively correct. And it seems to me that this utter hatred of anything that came before us, before kind of 1997, is bizarrely unhuman. It's not really something you see in history, even in barbaric. I mean, I would argue that this kind of behavior is what underpins barbaric societies as opposed to civilized ones. And even in those sorts of societies, when you study history, you don't see this hatred for your own ancestors. And I'd have to put ancestors in inverted quotations, because I suppose really that's the whole point of this movement, is that it's someone else's ancestors they're trying to get rid of, really.
Yeah, I would say, yeah, that we're told that we're supposed to be sort of empathetic and open to listening to different viewpoints and different communities and stuff, and it's like we're engaged in silencing the dead. Our previous generations were sort of enacting this sort of intense temporal snobbery, this idea that we are morally superior to the past and that we have a right to edit the past. There is also this culture of safetyism, which sees objects which set forth views that we don't agree with as being harmful, as being sort of like morally radioactive, and they must be removed from the public space in case they turn us into slavery advocates. I don't know. I mean, I never felt particularly drawn towards slavery when I walked past that statue, but maybe I'm sort of particularly resistant.
There's an interesting point around this, total removing of tradition and history. I guess, again, if we look again historically at what are those moments that this happens, it is very much, people have referenced kind of the Cultural Revolution, Bolsheviks removing Russia's past, for example. I think, Alex, you referenced it, don't you, in one of your articles? Was it Day Zero?
Yeah, the article is Towards Britain's Day Zero, which you can find on Spiked Online. And basically it's talking about the parallels between what's happening now and the Cultural Revolution. And I would say that the Cultural Revolution is perhaps a better analogy than other revolutions, because what you find in the Cultural Revolution it arose in the late 1960s, driven by Mao. And by that stage, China had already been communist for almost 20 years. And so the groundwork was already laid. People were already disposed to distrust the old ways, the traditions, the sort of history in general. They were told to be wary of it. And then what Mao did was he accelerated it. He said, the reason we have not achieved utopia, the reason we have not gone as far forward as we should have done, is because these old things have been holding us back. And we need to do more of the same, only intensified to a greater degree. And this means actually not just disdaining and excluding the past, but actually destroying it, completely erasing it. So what I see is that what's happening now is simply an acceleration of something that was already happening. In the French Revolution, the Russian Revolution, you can say, well, there's actually a regime change here. There's a change of ideologies. This is something new coming in. Whereas with the Cultural Revolution, it's an intensification of a situation that was already set up. And as we know, I mean, this has been basically set up by schools teaching that, that Britain's empire was uniquely bad compared to all the other empires that they don't actually teach anything about. And then you've got the neo-Marxist schools, you've got some critical theory, the Frankfurt School, you've got English, you've got history, you've got women's studies, race studies, queer studies, post-colonial studies, and so forth. And this is laying the groundwork. And just simply what we've got now is the activists saying, okay, well, you've talked about how terrible these things are. Now let's have a chance to do something about it. Let's actually bring these things down.
I think that's a really good point around how a lot of these institutions have been captured for a long time. And I think what a lot of, if you see the average, well, I always like looking at the Daily Mail comments, because while it's not the exact guide of the typical like Englander, it does give you a little segment of society. And a lot of those comments have been obviously very negative against the statues, but also surprised that this is happening. And again, I think a lot of people don't realise how captured so many of those institutions are, and like you said, I think you're right. We're almost we've been in this kind of communist state or whatever for, obviously not communist, but captured state for 20 years, and this isn't the revolution. This is just like maybe the existing power kind of showing force over the people.
I would say that this is the kind of end of the beginning of the revolution. This is because you look at, say, France, you look at Russia, obviously traditionally, there would be gangs of, people's militias going off to capture the post office and the telegraphs and the palaces and, literally seizing power. But of course, the last 20 years, you had, obviously, as we've discussed, the cultural revolution. And I think what we're seeing now is that initial, like the tearing down of the statues of the czars, or the trashing of the royal palaces in France, and the destruction of the clergy. We're seeing the sign that the institutions really have been captured. And depending on some say you could see this the moment it started. Some say it's only been apparent recently, but this is really what we're seeing. We're being signaled to that the institutions have been captured by whatever you want to call them, cultural Marxists, leftists, enemies of the old status quo. This is the sign that really they've kind of won this stage. They are just exercising the power they've captured now. They're using, like, just this evening read your article, Alexander, about the Arts Council. And that would be a prime example, especially when it comes to the topics we're going to discuss.
Well, I think maybe before we get to the Arts Council, I have an email here from the Museums Association, which is, if you ever thought that the Museums Association, which represents the professionals working in the museums organizations, was an upholder of the Enlightenment principles of museums, then you are going to be disappointed. I have an email that was circulated today. I'll just read part of it. Now, this is a comment piece, but this is in the Museums Journal, which is the Museums Association official organ. And this is written by Hitam Eid, and this is how he wants to see museums responding to the murder of George Floyd. I don't believe any museums were involved in the murder of George Floyd, though, we may yet have more information coming in on that. So he says, while some museums have taken to social media to condemn the despicable murder, most museums have remained silent or issued sluggish statements. The same social media platforms that museums depended on to carry out their missions during the pandemic are the same platforms through which the public held them accountable for their white supremacy legacy. He mentions the Getty, and then he goes on, dismantling white supremacy structures and institutional racism in museums is crucial to maintaining the integrity of museums as public institution. The responsibility lies with all of us. It is no longer acceptable for museum professionals to claim tolerance and good character on a personal level while participating in the same oppressive system that discriminates against and dehumanizes people of color. white supremacy structures and racist attitudes maintain their existence because of internal disengagement and complacency by many, quotes, good museum colleagues. Oh, God.
Yeah.
So I
think, again, what's really interesting about that is, number one, again, it just really comes out of that, like you said, post-colonial theory, all of these kind of theories which have those roots in cultural Marxism and communism finally coming to bear, where all of the elites that have been brought up with that understanding have now got positions of power that are then exerting. And again, it's just like when they talk about any museum as an institution of white supremacy is obviously ridiculous, and but they're still using these kind of moments to exert power and to effectively get what they want. What I think is really interesting, again, is just the kind of typical ignorance of the person out, like just the normal person doesn't realize, just how bad things are in regards to this kind of stuff. Because if you were to speak to them and ask them about, do you think a museum could even be a bastion of white supremacy, I think most people will just laugh it off. But this is this is a serious institution messaging other people, again, signaling to other curators and other members of boards, etc., that this is the position that you guys should have. So it's very worrying on many levels.
Well, to go back to what we were saying about revolution, in relevance to what you just said, if you look at, say, countries like the Soviet Union, I imagine China as well, but I haven't specifically looked into it. They didn't view 1917 as the revolution. They viewed the whole existence of that state as the revolution. That every year that they were supposed to be getting closer and closer to their stated goal, and I think that mindset has kind of infiltrated people in regards to race and in regards to gender. That people just take for granted that we ought to do something because there is still racism entrenched somewhere. There is sexism entrenched somewhere. It's got to be even if I don't think the statue should be coming down, well, these people are going to root out the racists and they're going to root out the sexists that are obviously there, that are obviously stopping us from creating this this kind of wonder society that's supposedly just round the corner, just as it was in Russia, just as it was in France and China. It's this attitude that it's the destruction of art that doesn't conform with our current standards is just it's one more little kind of tally on the chart. It's one step closer to the kind of utopia, and even it's not normally that mindset is just in the in the minds of Marxist intellectuals, but it seems to have really pervaded into even fairly right-leaning people and kind of like to use the term normies all over the spectrum.
Yeah, I think one of the difficulties is that it's a temperamental reaction, it's an emotional reaction, it's not an intellectual reaction. So if you've been conditioned to think of your society as set up on unfair bases, once someone comes in and says, oh, well, there's a simple problem and it's discrimination, and we've got a simple solution, and that is social justice. You say, most people who are normies, they say, oh, well, we'll just hand it over to you. You seem to know about it. It's the same way that people delegate to various lobbyists and various pressure groups when they say, oh, well, we'll come in and we'll analyze your problem. And, oh, guess what? We found it's worse than we ever dreamed, and you're going to need us to retrain your workers or your police or your museum staff. And we can do that for a certain fee, and we can monitor it, and we will report to Parliament on how we're getting on. I think that we overlook the idea, the fact that there's so much of an industry. The grievance study industry has expanded not only from university, but it's part of charities, it's part of lobbyists, it's part of activist groups. It's claimed lots of corporate organizations where they have like sort of people who are dedicated to sort of community outreach and so forth, and they're completely embedded in this system.
Yeah, I really like that idea of picking up the idea of the kind of was it permanent revolution or whatever, that
Yeah.
we're constantly looking for things to overthrow and remove. And I think that kind of ties back into some of the earlier stuff you're talking about, Alex, that, essentially it's not going to stop with this, this one statue or that statue. How do you guys see the kind of next year going in terms of, is it more statues going to be teared down? Do we really, I've seen a lot of stuff on Twitter about people saying first it's the statues, then it's the books, then it's the people. Do we really think that people are going to be assaulted for their views, or how do you think things will play out?
Oh, sorry, Alex,
Yeah.
you go first.
No, you go first for this one.
Okay. Well, I actually I'm not entirely convinced it's just going to accelerate, because it's not like a traditional kind of revolution where they've seized absolute state power and they can just dictate whatever they want. There's still an element of resistance. Like, for example, I think when Sadiq Khan ordered the Churchill statue to be boxed up, I don't think it was because he specifically wanted to see it boxed up, or because he genuinely believes Churchill was evil. I think it was because him and those sort of elites were worried that if that statue was trashed, the reaction might rally enough opposition to kind of end their dominance of the political and cultural institutions. Because if they go too far too fast, then there's always a chance that the backlash will be strong enough to get rid of them. And I think I think that's their greatest fear at the moment. I think there's not much chance of the mob turning on them, because they've got this kind of permanent revolution thing embedded in people's minds. So I think really what we're going to see is it might speed up, it might get worse, and I think that is pretty certain. But there will be stumbling blocks. There will be, like, for example, the Churchill statue. There will be these things that are just too, like, for example, the Bolsheviks never actually abolished the Orthodox Church in Russia, because it's one of those things that might just be this, the straw that broke the camel's back, so to speak. It might just push people a bit too far, and it might end up in a backlash. So I think there will be some breaks on this, but other than that, they'll be they'll just keep going, and I don't see why it wouldn't end up with then the books, then the people.
Well, I would say, well, for a start, I'd say it's already got there. So it's statues first. I heard that I just received news that the Rhodes statue is coming down from Oriel College, so that's gone. So the idea that that they're going to stop at that. The point, I think, you can't really negotiate with these people, because I mean, whatever you think of the IRA, they had a principal political aim, which was comprehensible, measurable, and achievable, and it was something that could be discussed, and it could be achieved. But with this this wave of hysteria, it's to do with people who are utopians. They will never be satisfied. And they are temperamentally activists. They're temperamentally radicals. They will go on and seek the next statue, the next book, and we've already seen it expand into books. And the thing is, it had already expanded to books and films anyway. You had music going, because it was supposed to be sexist, because of the Me Too era, and people censoring cartoons, or so it's already been there, and I think that it's already coming to people. I don't think there's any avoiding that, just because we've set up a denunciation society, and once you've got that set up, you're going to have, you need more material. You just need more material. So whether that's a statue or book or a film or a comedy series, and I think what's going to happen is that I want to start issuing little cards saying the 2020 race hysteria started off with good intentions, but it went a little bit too far. And then you can write in the date at the bottom when you think it went too far. And it'd be different for different people. It'd be when your favorite book was banned, or your favorite film was discontinued, or you couldn't get a comedy on streaming service, or your favorite comedian couldn't tour because he'd been cancelled. And I think that it will continue. As to how tactical I hadn't thought about how tactical the actual leaders are. I see it more as them trying to ride the tiger, and sometimes they're going to be in control of the tiger, and sometimes the tiger's going to take control over them. So we'll have to see how that works.
Sorry,
yeah.
go on.
Do you think there are two separate groups here? The obviously kind of the elites who have captured the institutions, and these, because obviously the left is obviously still a spectrum. The post-colonial narrative is pretty far left in terms of what they're demanding. Do we see them as the same group, or do we see them as two individuals fighting it out as well?
My view is that it's basically the far left and the majority of the entire population not understanding what they're facing. They don't understand exactly how much the radicals hate them, how much contempt these people have for the majority of the population and for all of history, all of British history. It's not just the slave traders, it's not just the colonials, it's all of them. And it's connected with, let's say, deeper antagonism towards the working class and majorities. And I think that the problem is that conservatives, they want to be loved. They think that if they just offer up a new, we'll let them have that statue or that film, and then they'll be happy, and then they'll stop. No, they're never going to stop. And I think that people on the right have not woken up to the fact that this is a non-stop campaign by the far left. And remember that to control an organization, you only need 15%. You don't need a majority. You just need 15% of people in key positions, high positions, and they can control an entire organization.
I mean, before I give a response to that, I'd say one more point on can they control the tiger? I mean, I think you're right in saying that occasionally the tiger will bite them back. I mean, and also it goes to show that it'll never be the kind of woke, because it's not centralized, because there's no kind of central leader organizing all of this. Different sections of it will start to attack each other. And I mean, one example of this for me very recently, just a few days ago, was the show that's been on in the UK recently, Killing Eve.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I remember watching about 6 episodes of that. I mean, it's pretty woke. You've got the one characters, sexually all over the place. Minority characters. The guy's, gay. There's no. It's very woke in that sense. But then, one picture came out of the writers' room, who were all white people, and it was like, oh well, now they're being attacked for having an all-white writers' room. It's that kind of, and it just made me laugh, because all those people agree with the woke principles, and yet they can't save themselves from it. And yeah, so and the other point, I think you're right that very few people realize exactly just how virulent this kind of wokeness is, and just how it's built on Maoist principles, essentially, that the revolution will never stop. There will be generation after generation after generation of people who will support it with all their hearts and genuinely believe what they're doing is right. Then they will be subsumed and consumed and spat out the other end, because they can't conform to the wokeness of the next wave of the revolutionaries, really.
Yeah, because you have the purity spiral, and then you have the denunciation society, and you have the sort of like the totalitarian thing where you're spying on your neighbor and you're having to inform on him.
Yeah, because I think one thing that's interesting is if you see someone like Sadiq Khan's response, who is your traditional, I guess, establishment left-winger, being in power for a large period of time, and I think when some of these protests started, he was very much on board. He was kind of backing them up, and then I think Panama, you've really touched upon something about the boarding up of the statues to protect them against the message, because I think someone like Sadiq, as more of a Machiavellian, he's less. I think he's less of an ideologue than a lot of these.
He isn't clueless. Like a lot of the kind of people on the ground are, I think.
That's it. Like, I think a lot of people on the ground, it's about emotion, it's about the idea. While for someone like Sadiq, it's about power and control. How can we maintain control and shape the country in a more of a kind of a Blairite-esque way? And they're making those tactical decisions because, again, like pictures like the guy setting fire to the British flag on the cenotaph. It was after that was a moment where all of the counter protesters came down, and I think that's where they really awoke. The sleepy whatever, like Middle
Sleepy
England or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
The third article for Spiked, which is not out yet, it will be out tomorrow or Friday, basically talks about the class aspect, because I think that people who are not from Britain won't understand that what's happening in Britain is not racial tension, it's class tension. It's basically left-wing middle-class people expressing or performing anti-racism as an activity, and also anti-patriotism. That it's not really to do anything sort of social justice or any particular issue. They're attacking national icons, basically to show that they are more anti-racist than the white working class population, who are just sort of who must be racist, who must be sort of degenerate scum if they love Churchill, if they respect war memorials, if they venerate Lord Baden-Powell or whatever. And this is a class issue. So what you're getting is the sort of the right-wing statue defenders are actually traditionalists. So it's not actually a right-left thing. It's more a sort of traditional and anti-traditional thing. What do you think of that breakdown?
Oh.
Yeah, no, I think it's very, very true. And again, in the kind of traditional mindset, there is the kind of the Second World War, Winston Churchill, hugely important figures. And again, just having the word racist underneath him, even if obviously, if you see some of the stuff he said is very unsavory, but in the traditionalist mindset, what he stands for in terms of how Britain is formed after the Second World War is just such a powerful and important figure that you can't sully him without raising up this ire. And you're 100% right about the kind of middle class. If you see the kind of footage of the Colston statue, it's definitely it's basically like a bunch of white young kids rolling the statue into the canal.
You put it more politely than I would put it, but I actually never got to watch it the next day.
I mean, I thought to myself when I saw, as you said, that footage of the Colston statue, and you look at all the people surrounding it, cheering and clapping. I thought if it wasn't for the lockdown, they'd be in the lecture theatre right now. They'd be in uni, or they'd be in sixth form, or this is. I think the class element is important here. It's although of course, because I think the reason that you're getting that kind of I don't know if classism would be the most accurate term, but I'll call it that for now. But basically, classism from the kind of middle class activist types is because the oppression narrative. Whereas in the last century, it would have been class. That's where the left fought its battles. It was, the working class are oppressed by the other classes, so we agitate on their behalf. Now it's just racial. So they'll happily throw either of any social class under the bus if it'll serve their needs, as the last 20 years have proved. It's that the white working class types are. Racist thugs, and their opinions don't matter. You should be punching them. You should be, we should be kind of exiling them from places of prominence. Just as in the last century, the kind of bourgeois oppressors would have been treated from the kind of leftist narrative.
I think that what you've got is you had this break in 1968 where the old left mutated into the sort of the rump of the old left, and then the new left, which was seeking to push social change not through class revolution but through various minority interests. So there they would latch onto the gay liberation movement and the feminist movement and the black rights, civil rights movement and so forth. And that was where the old left, the old sort of actually quite patriotic left, which was mainly a working class phenomenon, split into the old left, which was a sort of a class alliance, which was quite socially conservative and patriotic. And then you had the new left, which was mainly middle class people seeking to patronize various minorities, or political minorities as they were called. And that's where the big break happened. So I think, yeah, what you get is now you've got a vector of leftism and classism, leading to most of the protesters being sort of BLM, which doesn't really exist in Britain. But Antifa has always been very white, very middle class, very university educated and so forth. And I would say it's kind of ironic that all these brave anti-slavery protesters were so strong and stunning and brave, attacking this statue. But I noticed they didn't carry on their campaign to the nearest mosque, which I think was built to venerate someone who was indeed a slave trader and slave owner.
Well, I think that leads on to quite an interesting point around how all of this is very one-sided. You know, obviously that whole history of Islam issue has been brought to attention, but also I think, for example, the Guardian, which was run by the guy who made money from slaves. It's very telling that everything that everyone that's been targeted is either neutral or on the right, and any kind of analysis of left heroes in terms of their positions on slavery or race have mainly been ignored. So do we think that this is just purely just kind of really just shows that this is just all about power and control, and not necessarily about ideology? Or do you feel like do you think that these mobs will turn on left figures that did say racist things in the past?
Mr. Hat?
I think that entirely depends on the kind of leftist figures themselves, and because the thing is, if the see the thing, I'm kind of stumbling here because it's quite difficult to put into words, but I think provided they can keep their fingers on the pulse of what the next kind of big woke talking point is, they'll be fine. But you will get people that slip through the net. You'll end up with a Jermaine Greer, or there's an American academic whose name I can't remember now, who kind of is very anti the modern left, who was kind of all for it in 68, but can't stand it now. You will get people like that who are intelligent and also kind of brave enough to be genuine to themselves. But
I would say, I think that you get, what you can do is you can maneuver people on the left who already subscribe to something to self-cancelling. You just get them to self-cancel because they supposedly believe these ideas. So you put enough pressure on them and they cancel themselves. And it's amusing to watch, but it's kind of not very impressive. Sometimes it's difficult to cancel people on the right because they are actually part of organizations which will back them and support them. So, for example, I mean, I'm not sure if I would class myself as on the right. I mean, I would say I'm an English liberal, but the organizations I work for, the editors and the publications I write for are sort of right-leaning, or they're independent, or they want really strong independent voices. So when someone says, oh, that so-and-so's a racist or whatever, they say, well, not really, and I don't care, and what he writes for me isn't racist. So you've got those, but very often, even in the political sphere, because what happened to Roger Scruton was, he was set up by a left-wing journalist, and he was hounded on social media. He lost his advisory position, which was completely unpaid, and he was basically deposed by the Conservative government. So even the Conservative government cucks.
Yeah, that brings us nicely onto the Conservatives. What do we think? Like, how do we think their response has been? Yeah, good or bad?
Well, as usual, completely unsatisfactory. Just utterly. But again, I'm not surprised because they've been doing this in to a greater or lesser extent, basically since the 1840s. I mean, especially the UK Conservative Party. Its job is to stay in power. It's basically a tool for people to get into power who aren't ideologically aligned, and it's basically a massive fraud party that tricks people into voting for it because they think that it's gonna stop progressive change, that it's going to stop the left. All it does is Charlemagne, who I think might be in the chat, says that sums it up best. He says it's progressivism at the speed limit, essentially.
Yeah. Or you could also say, or as Binary Surfer puts it, it's never just the tip.
Yeah. And I think they see themselves as not conservative, not defending anything. Currently, this Conservative Party sees itself as the paternalistic guardians of modern Britain, and they refuse to believe that any actions taken over basically the past 50 years were wrong, and they'll continue to defend the temporary status quo. So I'm not surprised that they've completely cucked to this. They haven't really condemned it. They've got Priti Patel, as kind of the facade, the kind of, that's enough to placate conservative voters who think, Priti Patel's there. She'll make sure this doesn't go too far. The reality is she won't, because even if she wants to, the party won't let her.
There was a lot of
civil service won't let her as well.
Of course,
there was a lot of hype about Priti when she came in. She said, had a lot of talk, but has she actually done anything significant so far? And I think the answer is no. Alex, what do you think about the Conservatives in this situation?
Yeah, well, I think they've been feeble, but I think that you can only expect that. I mean, remember, Theresa May declared herself to be a feminist, and she said that the Conservatives were a party of social justice. Cameron was all on board for the environmental activism and so forth. And the thing about Boris is he's a urban, cosmopolitan, socially liberal politician who just happens to be a member of the Conservative Party. He wouldn't have been that out of place, apart from his accent, in Blair's Labour Party. Well, I don't know, maybe not, but he's not got any conservative principles. He doesn't have any socially conservative views. He's certainly not expressed. He's not fiscally conservative. We can't expect him to do anything other than what looks expedient for Boris in the immediate future.
I guess one thing that I have seen, Dominic Cummings was tweeting about this the other day, is that apparently they've banned protests larger than a size of 6 people. Do you think that is going to be enough to stop the protests this weekend, or in general?
If they enforce it, and if the local politicians and the local police chiefs actually want to enforce it, then yes, that could. But I noticed they only did that after the right-wing statue defenders came out.
Well, of course, they can get away with doing what they want to them without suffering any negative image, really. Because if they came down hard on the initial protest, then they could be painted as, racists and, kind of the antithesis of what they want to appear as. So I think that's the reason why. And a couple of things. I mean, I think that you do have some genuinely, now they would be called reactionary because, they have no truck with today's views and today's kind of milieu, rightfully, in my opinion. You do have kind of actual right wingers in that party who would be willing to, undertake kind of radical action to kind of stop what the left is doing. But the problem is, they're tiny individuals in the midst of a nation that's been seized in a leftist coup. Even if you had a genuinely right-wing prime minister, you still have this enormous civil service nebula that's going to try and stop them. You have all the quangos, you have all the institutions, whether they're artistic or they're to do with the police or the military or their civil institutions, criminal institutions. You've got the High Court full of activists and activist jurists and kind of think tanks that publish snowstorms of papers decrying the anything government might do as harmful to the nation. So even if the Conservative Party wanted to act against the left, it basically wouldn't stand a chance. It's surrounded by enemies.
Yeah, you could say that the leftists have their hands on the levers of power already. So there's very little that even elected politicians could do, even if they wanted to.
Yeah, I really like Tucker Carlson's last video where he was obviously doing this sarcastically before I get in trouble for it, but he was basically saying, there's no point in democracy, no point in anything else. It's just pure violence, pure power. That's all you need to do to achieve stuff. And again, when we talk about MPs have voted for a law where we're restricting the number of protesters, they're already not allowed to gather together because of COVID. But if the police aren't willing to enforce those laws, we're basically in a state of mob rule. Surely, like the people that we've voted in have no power over, these mobs. Okay. Well, one thing I wanted to finish off on this section.
Yeah, I completely agree with you.
Yeah. One thing I wanted to finish up on this section was just like a reflection on this idea of like visible sins and secret sins, and I think what's interesting about all of these statues is that the people who've been targeted are the people that have had stuff revealed about their lives. For example, Winston Churchill, said what he said or whatever, but obviously there's hundreds of statues, hundreds of artists and people who have been represented in art who probably said stuff to behind closed doors or to their friends and family, but it was never publicized as well. So we've actually got this kind of two-tiered type of people where only the people who have these visible sins are being targeted, and all of these people who have these secret sins that we don't know about aren't being targeted. And I think that's something interesting and that won't be thought of by the mob at all.
My view on that is that if you have a denunciation society, you inform on people, you do offence archaeology, as Toby Young puts it. But then there are things where you just involve exaggeration or claims, and then you reach a stage where you just invent stuff, and then you just reach a stage where you just have to name a person and you don't need to explain it, because you have a cycle, you have a system, you have a dynamic which is set up to target and take down people, and what they've actually done and what you actually know that they've done and what you can prove that they've done and what they have done but you just don't know about it, that kind of becomes irrelevant. It's sort of like once the sort of the mob dynamic takes hold and you have a culture of denunciation where no one stops to actually fact check anything, then the actual levels of sin, as it were, don't actually come into play anymore. That's my view.
Yeah, definitely interesting. Okay, cool. So the next section I wanted to talk about was around iconoclasm and religion. And obviously, if you look at the history of iconoclasm, if you look at, for example, the Abbasid Caliphate, where they kind of removed the image from all of their coinage and art. If you look at the kind of two periods of Byzantine iconoclasm, and again, the Reformation and Cromwell, you have these moments where the image is being removed and destroyed, and it's tied to religion. Now, interestingly, with the Eastern Roman iconoclasm, they just destroyed icons, so like the pieces of wood with pictures of the saints on, etc. But they did not destroy like artistic statues, to my knowledge, from what I've read about it. Do you think that do you guys think there's a religious element to this at all, or do you think it's just something totally different?
Panama?
Well, my personal kind of philosophy is that all political error, and to a greater degree, all political thought, is rooted in theology of some form. And so, yes, I think that this is a religious phenomenon, but I think it's powerful because the symbols in themselves mean so much because they register on an emotional level, not a rational one. Seeing just as you couldn't have a monument to Allah in the middle of Catholic Spain in the 1400s, you could not have a monument to Christ in the Umayyad Caliphate, right? So in a society in which racism is the greatest possible flaw, the greatest possible sin, the kind of preventer of utopia, having a statue to a man who traded black slaves is beyond unthinkable. It would create a kind of nausea, I think, within the true believers in this sort of thing. So I think that's why I think, like religion, and this isn't me talking down religion as a Catholic, but because it registers on an emotional level, the symbols are more powerful than, say, a Roger Scruton book, which is why I think that this is why we don't start with the book burnings. A right-wing author discussing why, in rational and lengthy terms, why they don't believe in leftism is far less powerful than a statue of Winston Churchill, say, because they register on a more visceral and more human level.
Yeah, you could say it's more abstract, it's more distant, and also you're going to get people who are just not going to read the book. And it's much easier to have a visual, physical symbol than a book, which is, well, frankly, only distinguishable from another book. If you're going to be destroying it from its cover, there's not much gratification in that. And also, I think it's a spite thing. It's malice. It's a sense of inadequacy. It's this feeling that, well, I am morally superior to this person, and they have a statue. Why did they get a statue when I know that racism is wrong? He didn't know that. And you're driven by emotion and by malice and by pettiness to bring something down which was greater than you. That's why you get the so-called SJW culture. It's basically parasitizing. It's not creating anything new because it's kind of paralyzed with fear about missteps. So it's basically it's parasitizing, it's destroying, it's altering, it's removing canon, it's defacing. So the drive of this woke religion, I think, and I do think it's it's certainly a cult. The cult of wokeism is primarily destructive because as soon as you create anything, someone's going to find a fault in it. It's not going to be good enough. It's not going to be pure enough. It's not going to be anti-racist enough. It's not. It's going to be, there's going to be some element of privilege involved. So that's why it's essentially negative, destructive, parasitical, rather than creative.
Yeah, interesting. I think there's a really interesting point around that. Why the statues are chosen first. Again, I think it's really worth checking out that Bristol statue video again, because I just feel like if you see all the kind of people around, they are in almost some kind of religious ecstasy, and there's a moment of pure, happiness and pleasure that by taking down the statue, they've appeased their god or something like that. Something really raw and fundamental when you watch that.
It's Lord of the Flies stuff, really, isn't it?
Yeah.
I don't want to inject too much of my own politics into this, but I believe in the Chestertonian maxim that when we remove religion, or say we remove Christianity from the West, the danger is not that people don't believe in anything; it's that they'll believe in anything. And that's what I was seeing, say in the video of them pulling down that statue in Bristol. It's that these, like you said, it was almost religious ecstasy. That these people believe they are almost like God's chosen people. They are the ones building the utopia on Earth. By pulling down this statue, these people genuinely believe they are making the world a better place to live, which is why there is such a frenzy.
And you also see this as like the Russian Revolution has been described as a millenarian cult. It's like a religious cult. It was indeed about completely abolishing the family, abolishing the church, abolishing the state, completely changing, revolutionizing the whole of human existence. And you do get that sense that, but there's also something very, not just religious, but infantile and childish about the joy in destroying something that you actually couldn't create.
Well,
they couldn't have sculpted anything. They couldn't have written anything good. They couldn't have built a great building. And I think in their hearts they know that, and that's why destruction is so much more easy and satisfying than failing as a creator.
Mm-hmm. I think that's quite profound, and I think really gets to the heart of what we were seeing. And going back to what I said earlier, about focusing on the present, they're pulling down statues because they don't yet have anything they could build a statue of. Like it's the purity thing. They couldn't put up a statue of Martin, Luther King. I don't think they could even put up a statue of George Floyd because they'd be halfway through, and then he wouldn't be pure enough. He wouldn't be woke enough.
There'd be like you'll always find something, but he hit a woman once. Oh God, okay, right, he's off the list then. And that's the point. I think that people who are saying like this, it will only be this sin. It will only be the people who are racist who are actually racist. No, it's going to be anyone. It's going to be anyone who hit a woman. It'll be anyone who used a racial epithet, anyone who ate meat, anyone who went big game hunting in the year 1900. All of them. They're all going to go eventually. It's just an order of which the opportunists and the activists are going to get to them.
Just on that, obviously we've had the wave of the Me Too wave. We've had the LGBTQ wave, and this is obviously the post-colonial wave. You mentioned around that's a really interesting point around the big game hunting. What do you think the next wave after post-colonial could be? Maybe vegan, or is that too absurd? What do you think? Yeah.
Well, I mean, my guess is it's going to be violence against women. So you're going to get people coming after John Lennon, and remember that although John Lennon in his later years was a terrible feminist and a simp, he was this was partly driven. You often find this. Male feminists are often driven by guilt about things that they've done in the past, or they are seeking to cover up or atone for things that they've done in the past. So you find heroes of the left or heroes of feminism or whatever, and you just scratch below the surface and you'll find all sorts of nasty stuff. So I would say violence against women. I mean, I would say things about like paedophilia or something, but to be honest, I think the left is not as critical of that area as it should be. So
no, they really aren't. They're because it would give them too much pushback on themselves, I think.
Yeah, because they're I mean, if you watch some of the TV programs or the various sort of we seem to have missed out on Gay Pride this month, so that's an upshot of COVID, isn't it?
I think it's impossible to predict exactly what the next kind of woke trend will be, but I mean, I don't think it would be at all absurd if it was veganism, because I mean, we're already seeing a kind of snobbishness and a kind of standoffishness between vegans and meat eaters, especially in the cities where most of this takes place. I mean, there is a kind of not only a virtue aspect to being vegan, but there's also definitely a class issue there. I think the vegans are predominantly younger middle class student activist types, and I don't think you see many sort of working class people start going vegan in great numbers. So it's another thing they could play on from that angle.
I would have said like eco-activism, but eco-activism is very vague, and it is so diffuse that you'd have difficulty sort of taking it up as a sort of as a cause for mobs. Because also, I mean, recently we had Greta Thunberg come to Bristol in, I think it was February, and she came and gave her whatever speech on the college green. So I think there's certainly a constituency for eco-activism, but I'm not sure how that would actually play out. I think you'd actually need something more visceral that didn't implicate whole societies. And so I would say violence against women, possibly meat eating, possibly capitalism, possibly colonialism.
I would just say I actually I've been thinking about this. I don't think they're going to go near capitalism because it's working so much to their advantage at the moment. Because they wouldn't go against corporatism, perhaps. This kind of the massive corporations who, as long as it will earn them a buck, will happily prostrate themselves and go on about how woke they are and about how much they care about the struggle. And you can have your iPhone case with a picture of George Floyd on it, just like you can have your red T-shirt with Shay on it, just like you could, in the day. It's these. And
how many millions have they donated to Black Lives Matter, which has been, well, anyway, that's a big subject. But the whole financial side is worth examining, perhaps in a different people, different time.
Yeah, I think there's a really interesting dynamic between, again, the activist on the ground and the corporations. So, for example, you saw, recently it was at Atlanta where they burned down that Wendy's, and literally the day before, Wendy's was like, "Oh yeah, we support BLM members," and again, it's almost kind of like this weirdly one-sided. But like, I think you are right, Panama. I think certainly the elites or the people running the group realize they're on the gravy train and that they are connected and that they're working on the same side. But I think part of the again, the guy on the ground who's being manipulated here, they're constantly told that as part of that in indoctrination that you mentioned, Alex, going through school and university, that they are the rebel, and the rebel cannot be part of the establishment. It cannot be supported by the corporation. But when you step back a second and say, okay, who are the people tweeting in support of the violence? Like and who's donating? It is the celebrities, it is the institutions, and it is the corporations at the same time. So they have,
sorry, no, go on, I interrupted.
That was it. That was done.
Well, I mean, as well, they're not the people. The kind of elites and the activists that are currently in power, it wouldn't make any sense for them to turn on capitalism because for one, there's no longer really any kind of strength in the orthodox kind of Marxist material struggle now, because I think in the West we've reached a point of kind of economic prosperity that it's increasingly hard to play on economic hardship as a kind of, in the West, as a kind of driving cause for social change, which I think is why there's been such an exodus of leftists onto racial and colonial and national theories. And the other thing is that a lot of the elites, as you say, they're feathering their own nests within this system. They're not interested in forging a moneyless society where there isn't the systems that are keeping them in metaphorical fur coats and pearl earrings, so to speak.
Cool. So the next thing I wanted to just chat about was around I've called it the portrayed versus the portrayer. Everything that's been focused is very much around who the statues were made of and who they represent. But what I think is interesting is that there hasn't been much uprising against necessarily the artists themselves. And I saw on Twitter there's a few people mentioning Eric Gill, for example, and the statue on the front of the BBC building. And for those who don't know, like Eric Gill's quite a famous sculptor, but his personal life, let's just say, is rather decadent and bohemian in many ways, including
You're struggling not to say the word degenerate.
Yes, yeah. He basically was an absolute degenerate in his spare time, essentially, and would do things that, again, the mob should on paper find reprehensible. So I guess my question is, guys, is there more of a preference on who the statue represents, and do you think that would switch at all? Will people focus on artists?
I don't think people will focus on art. Well, the thing is, the current trend is towards a kind of pure ideology-fueled iconoclasm. So the tearing down of the statue is more important than kind of excoriating whoever made it, essentially. So it doesn't matter who put up the say the statue of Colston in Bristol. All that matters is there was a statue of a slave trader. So unless the kind of unless the ideology somehow adapts to also cover artists themselves, and I don't really think so, because it's kind of secondary importance.
Yeah, I would agree. I think it's the pure symbolism of the subject which exercises the mobs, because it's so easy to convey. You say this, especially if it is an image of a person who you have been told is to be hated, is to be despised, and their image must be destroyed. It's a very primitive response. Yeah, so the Jacob Epstein sculptures were of he was very involved in a sort of revival of the antique, and he was very interested in sort of Jewish and biblical mythology, and so he created these sculptures on the BBC building, which sort of show I think various naked people, because that was part of the primitivist aesthetic of sort of the 1910s and 1920s. And that's when you see the rise in nudism and so forth. Yeah, so obviously that's been attracted some comment, not least because of the fact that the BBC has been linked with sort of various individuals who were involved in child abuse and so forth. I mean, I personally don't think there's a connection, but obviously it doesn't look very good. I'm personally opposed to taking them down, because it would be hypocritical, because I tend to say everything should come up and should stay up unless there is an immediate danger of it being destroyed. And I would also say, someone also mentioned somewhere, oh well, what would you have your Russia full of Stalin statues and Iraq full of Saddam Hussein statues, because you don't like statues being pulled down. Well, I would say there's a balance. You can keep everything up, you can keep nothing up. I would suggest you keep up in place for context. You keep up a few examples. Other examples you remove to museums or parks or so forth, and this has been done in various countries. And then if you have lots of works which are basically replicas, then yes, I think those can be removed, because if they have little or no artistic value, they should be they can be at least put into storage. I think you should have some average examples, just because the average is kind of interesting when you're looking at things in a historical sense. But yes, you're right. It's definitely the people and the subjects portrayed rather than the artist at the moment. If you expand it to artists, then what are you going to do about Caravaggio, who murdered someone, or Leonardo, who was wasn't he convicted of sodomy with youngsters or something? There's been various artists who've done bad or questionable things in the past, but it's such a broad subject that I think it's even the activists have trouble getting worked up over it. But I do think that Eric Gill, who you mentioned, he may be a target, and we may see some of his stuff coming down. The Tate has quite a lot. The Tate is very left, is the national organisation for National Museum of British Art and Modern Art. They're very susceptible to political arm twisting, and in fact, they're actually keen. They're keen to have their arm twisted. They're offering to have their arm twisted, and so the Eric Gill will be. They'll go. Graham. There was a case of censorship with Graham Ovenden. Graham Ovenden is a 1960s and 70s artist, a ruralist, the Rural Brotherhood that formed in the 1970s, who were figurative artists. He was convicted of, I think he was it convicted of sex crimes or having child pornography in sort of, I don't know, what, 2012 or 2010 or something. And the Tate immediately withdrew from its archive material that was not pornographic, that was in its archive, and it couldn't even be accessed by specialists who were, researching the artist or researching this period. They could not access works in British collections because the director at the time, that was Nicholas Sirota, did not think it was allowable for people to see non-pornographic works by an artist who had been convicted of child sex offences. So we can see, I think we can see where this is going.
I think there's an interesting point there where I think it's not the mob who would pick up on the artists. Again, they're just approaching it from that emotional, religious, symbolic perspective. But again, it's those institutional elites who may target the artist instead. I think, and that kind of sits nicely with our kind of next talking point around this institutional iconoclasm. I'm definitely seeing a trend. We've already sort of seen it creep through with, for example, the Arts Council England guidelines on funding, where you have to have a certain level of diversity in your exhibitions and shows to receive your funding. And I'm imagining, I'm sure you know this way better than I do, Alex, but as a trend, I am seeing preference placed on art just purely because of their physical characteristics, as opposed to any kind of objective idea of this is good art versus this is bad art.
Yeah, basically the Arts Council is demanding that programming is no longer on the basis of artistic quality or originality or influence. It's based on demographic characteristics, so that be skin color, ethnicity, national origin, sexuality, gender, sex or gender. And yeah, so this has become a very serious problem, and now it's instantiated in law. So you can't get funding until you're meeting certain targets, not only with artists, but also with your audience. You have demographic targets for your audience. Oh, obviously, some people try to record this, and it's not very accurate. But venues are doing this all the time. They're terribly sensitive about this. They're terribly sensitive about the fact that white people, middle-class people, tend to visit art galleries more than other groups of people who knew. And they've had this problem where they have to try and get away from that. So you get situations where museums are bussing in school loads of ethnically diverse school children, to bump up their numbers and so forth. But it applies to staff as well. It's so terrible. And the next artist who's going to be representing Britain at the Venice Biennale is someone called Sonia Boyce. Sonia Boyce is a black feminist artist who's known for being black and feminist. And in a way,
as opposed to being known for art.
Well, yeah. I mean, I couldn't really tell you anything about her art. I mean, I may have seen it, but it's been sort of wiped from my memory. The problem is, I hesitate to say race grifter because that sort of kind of suggests intention. I think that's what happens is you're an artist and you want to do well, and you have these people in positions of authority. So they're your teachers at university or at art school, or they run the local cooperative art gallery, or they're the local art critic, and they take you up because you're black, or because you are gay, or because you're a woman. And then you're encouraged to produce more, and then you're invited to do a show which is full of lesbian artists or whatever. I don't know if Sonia Boyce is a lesbian, I'm just saying, you know, for example. And you're being given this sort of trail of breadcrumbs that you just follow. And and before you know it, you become the lesbian artist, you become the black artist, you become the feminist artist. And I'm not sure how intentional it is. I think it's because you're being surrounded by people who are patronizing you and patronizing you. And this leads you down a particular route. And then at some stage, your career is already set and you are known as the person who does the so-and-so, who gets the Arts Council grants for, you know, being a so-and-so demographic. And so I'm kind of wary about saying race grifter, but certainly there's institutional collusion which leads to the situation where you have people of this character ending up in this situation.
Yeah, and I guess it's not what you would traditionally call iconoclasm. People aren't going into museums and destroying kind of traditional artworks of...
Well, actually, I'll give you an example. Sonia Boyce herself went into, she was invited to the Manchester City Art Galleries in 2017, 2018, and her artwork was removing a painting by a pre-Raphaelite painter in order to, quote, start a conversation. So
yeah, that's really interesting, and I think even outside those kind of more explicit forms, I think there is this kind of more subtle form of iconoclasm in the form of again this preferential, but also the hiding away of kind of traditional, you know, like native artists or whatever. I was reading an interesting article on the Critic. It wasn't one of yours, Alex, actually, but about museums, you know, selling on some of their kind of existing stock. And again, I think one of the big concerns for me when I hear all of this kind of emphasis placed on, you know, the characteristics of an artist as opposed to the quality of the art is, you know, are we looking at, with all of these captured institutions, ultimately the kind of sale of you know, this huge artistic legacy? Do you think that could happen at all? Or
yeah, absolutely. There's a problem. So at the moment we have a law which prevents museums from deaccessioning. Deaccessioning is the process of removing a work of art from a permanent collection, or any kind of object from a permanent collection. Now, generally, it's only very limited to cases where an object can no longer be preserved, it's deteriorated to such a state, or there is a duplicate. So, for example, you have prints. So you have two engravings, and they're absolutely identical. So, okay, if you've got two copies, why not sell one? Because, you know, frankly, it is kind of it's redundant. But so we have a law which prevents deaccessioning. The problem is, if you open the door to deaccessioning for financial reasons or for whatever, more general reasons, which is something that happens a lot in America. This is a sort of common museum practice in America, and it has its own problems. The problem is that as soon as you open the door to deaccessioning, you will get, and I wrote a response to that deaccessioning piece that you talked about, that you read. I wrote my response. My response is coming out in the next issue of the Critic, and it's basically saying, once you open the door to deaccessioning, museums are only going to be too happy to start selling off art by men, by white people, by anyone convicted of a crime, anyone who's you know, committed any sort of moral infraction. You'll have women, you'll have feminists demanding that paintings of the rape of the Sabines will be removed, the abduction of whoever is going to be, the statues have to be removed, images of slaves will have to be removed for racial sensitivity and so forth. As soon as you get any form of deaccessioning, the lobbyists are going to come in, and the things they're going to be welcomed with open arms by activist curators and directors. or not. Or not. I don't know. What do you think?
I didn't know if the stream had gone off there for a second. Sorry. I mean,
sorry, I had the mic off. Carry on there, Panama.
No, it's all right. Go on.
All I was saying, sorry, was just on the activist curator thing. I think there's an interesting point, because I don't know if you heard recently about that woman from Oxford who was actively encouraging, or she was telling people about the chemicals required to dissolve metal and stuff like that. And again, there's this kind of class of, these are literally conservatives, people who should be looking after art, deciding, what is ethically good and what is ethically bad, and encouraging the destruction of all kinds that aren't fitting.
And I think you also have the problem that because the ideology that pervades in these institutions is so focused on the present and the supremacy of present ideology, present culture, present thought, present, and anything. These kind of priceless works, that have stood the test of time, become essentially valueless. They're just taking up space in a storage room at that point, and the institutions are aware that they're getting in fleets and fleets of people that meet their expectations, and they just want to do I don't know, black lesbian art shows, or what was the one you cited in your article, Alex? Was it queer? Was it a queer rave?
Yeah, it was a queer techno rave.
Queer techno rave,
which involved a display of gay pornography.
Yes.
At the ICA, which is on the Mall, the same street as Buckingham Palace.
And there you are. It's this, what is the worth of Romantic era, or classical, or Renaissance paintings, or the value of the old masters? Because at the end of the day, these are just white men who were probably overprivileged and worked off the backs of people who they oppressed with their whiteness or their maleness or whatever. So I wouldn't be surprised if a lot of these works of art are shipped off, or just, I'm not entirely convinced they'll be destroyed, because again, it's almost too kind of too visceral. But I imagine that they'll just be got rid of in some way, probably shipped off to the Middle East to private collectors or something, or places that can that would want them.
Alex, just coming back to this kind of institutional capture issue, is there any other kind of areas that you think is worth talking about or worth highlighting for those who may not necessarily be as versed in the kind of art industry as yourself?
Well, I mean, I would say, so we've talked about the Arts Council, we've talked about the Museums Association. The government is also complicit in this. I mean, the Department of Culture, Media, Sport and Digital does not pay very much attention to culture. They have had, in the last 10 years, I think they've had 10 ministers. So no one even finishes reading their brief before they're off to the Foreign Office or the Treasury or whatever. Don't overlook the role of lobbyists and charities. There are various charities which are dedicated to using art channels for social justice, and they have a great deal of influence. I would mention one in particular, and this is all on record, so I'm not sort of revealing anything secret. Elizabeth Murdoch, daughter of Rupert Murdoch, is a very big figure in the media world. She's also married to an artist called Keith Tyson, who once won the Turner Prize, the prize which I think is now defunct. I think it's sort of, I think anyway. That's sort of ancient history now. I think that's going to be cancelled. But so she's married to Keith Tyson. She heads something called the Freelands Foundation, which is basically a woman's advocacy group, and they donate money in order to promote women's art. they made a donation of over, I think it was over £100,000 to the South London Art Gallery. South London Art Gallery in, I think, 2019 exhibited the art of 2 men and the art of 9 women. So I don't know whether or not the influence comes before or after the donation, but you also have the fact that she, Elizabeth Murdoch, is also a member. I think she's the chairman of some advisory board on the Tate. The Tate is run by Maria Balshaw, an avowed feminist who studied critical theory and English, specifically Black American literature, and who has no qualifications in art history, is not a curator, has never written on art at all. So you can see there's a nexus of the way that charities and organizations work hand in hand. There's a lot of money changing hands. And I don't say that it's corrupt, I just say that it's certainly influencing decision making.
Yeah, I guess they, put the money where their ideology is, and then the rest is incentives. Like you said, whether it's the gallery, bowing to the money, or them connecting with galleries, it doesn't really matter in many ways. It's where the money is. Yeah, stuff's going to get promoted, and artists are going to get more famous, which is quite interesting. Okay, that's really interesting. Thanks for that. So I just wanted to finish up with basically some discussion around kind of potential futures. Where do we think this is kind of all ending up? I mean, we touched upon it a little bit, but also I wanted to think about how do we prevent what's going on? Are we totally helpless? Who are the kind of people that we should be emulating? And what can we do to stop everything being sold off to China, for example, if anything at all?
Panama?
Well, I think you should probably go first on this one, because I think you've been more knowledgeable on this.
Okay. Well, my view is don't allow a deaccessioning. That's a short road to pretty much everything getting sold off. Don't give in to demands to remove statues for various reasons. There are various reasons to keep material visible and public, and not least as a teaching aid. So you show, if you want to demonstrate the power and influence of slavery, then you keep up these monuments, you keep up these statues, you keep the names, because then you can teach it and you can say, why is the so-and-so hall called the so-and-so hall? It's because it was the money to found it was donated by someone who's in the slave trade. What do we think of that? And so on and so forth. But once you start erasing history, you can't really teach it anymore. And the fact is that you get to that stage and you don't want to teach it anymore anyway. You start just churning out propaganda. If there's something controversial, contextualize it, put up a plaque. You can also put up other works of art that are sort of maybe, if you've got a statue of a slaver, then maybe on the other side of the square you want to put up a statue of a slave. Seems perfectly reasonable. So don't give in to that. Don't suppress history. Don't change names. Don't give in, because you're not only is it a bad thing, you're going to encourage more of the same. Resist it. Prevent people from destroying things through violence. Don't prosecute where possible. Prevent damage. Restore things. Restore things. Put money back into changing names back to what they were. Maybe not all of them, but just some of them. And I think that's a good start anyway.
Panama?
I think in terms of what we can do kind of against this, I think in terms if you can still be getting works of art, whether it's poems or any sort of book or pieces of art out there, then that isn't just it doesn't have to be explicitly opposed to the kind of leftist climate, but just as long as it doesn't bow down to it, then I think that's admirable. But in terms of kind of artistic and intellectual resistance, I don't think there's anything worthwhile, any worthwhile option currently available. I think the best thing is just to kind of steal yourself away. Make sure your library or your workshop or your studio is full of things that just by their nature oppose the current climate, just by the fact that they don't accept this ideology. Essentially, the phrase I used in a video I made was pack a survival kit for an indefinite stay in the Arctic, artistically and intellectually. So I don't want to be too blackpilling, but essentially it's get in the foxhole and shut the cover.
And also physical media, because they're coming for your Netflix, they're coming for your streaming services.
Oh yeah,
they're coming for your cloud storage. So you be careful. If you love something, get it on physical media and keep it, because already it's getting difficult to get uncensored versions of this or that. Go for physical media, keep it. I mean, eventually there'll be laws against you having this or that article in your collection, and then you have to make a decision. But go for physical media, because the censorship is coming for the things that you love.
So, yeah, that's really interesting about the physical stuff. I've seen a few kind of Twitter posts around that. Panama, going to you a second. I've heard that there's the Benedictine option book. Is that kind of ideas similar to that? Where the Benedictine monks sort of squirreled themselves away during the kind of times of trouble in Western Europe, and kept up their kind of knowledge for storage for later years. I think certainly there's a little Peter Hitchens in my mind that is constantly saying there's kind of like no hope. But I think we need to kind of still try our best.
I've got a cause for hope. Breaking news! I can tell you that I am writing a new book. I mean, you probably don't care, but I've been commissioned to write a new book on iconoclasm and identity politics, and it's going to be published this autumn by Imprint Academic. And it's so it follows up my first book, Culture War, and I would say that a lot of what we're discussing here, I think, is going to make its way into the book. So if any of us are still buying books, or we're still allowed to buy books, then maybe keep an eye open for this in October.
Yeah, definitely, and I think there has been more of an. Again, that's not like one good thing is that there's definitely been more interest, more people sort of waking up to what's going on, and I think people are starting to realise these institutions are captured. Just in terms of something I've heard kind of talked about is we should start our own museums and collections and circles of artists. How realistic do you think that is, Alex, in terms of value, and can we create a meaningful artistic movement outside of this kind of academic and monetary pressure?
Well, potentially, yes. I mean, you could go back to the old model of having private patrons who would have control over something, and I think that's quite a promising option, because it keeps you away from state funding, because state funding leads to state control and the influence of the cathedral, as it were. However, we do also have this with the, build your own. If you don't like social media, build your own social media. Oh yeah. Now Amex is sort of cutting off your payment services. Oh, now patrons turning you out because they've come under political pressure. Oh, build your own financial platforms. Oh, build your own currency. Oh, build your own country. It's like, well, where do you stop? I saw a brilliant meme that was related to pop culture, but I think I'll read this out. It's very brief. So it's an internet meme showing a circle of stages. So you've got to imagine there are 4 stages and there's sort of like arrows going between them, and it goes in a circle. So it's called the circle of diversity. So circle 1, so part 1, we demand to be included in your space and make it more diverse and inclusive. Part 2, we demand you change this space for our liking and ban stuff that offends us. Part 3, we demand that you be kicked out of this space we created since you offended us. Part 4, lol, if you hate us, why don't you just go and make your own space? Go to step 1.
Yeah, I think there's a really interesting point around that, and again, especially in the art world, I think you do need to tap in to existing pieces. You know, it's like Reynolds says, you know, you can't, nothing comes from nothing, and all of the great artistic movements have tapped into a vein of previous culture, and if we did sort of go off by ourselves and try and create everything outside of the existing structures, you're missing out on all of everything that we've built up in the British Museum and or the Royal Academy or whatever. And it's just so much harder to produce something new without that kind of foundation. So I think it's a real challenge. One thing I thought that could be interesting was around education. And again, I think, Alex, like you mentioned, we're up against generations of people who, haven't got any idea about art history at all, or even in their art lessons, they're already kind of pushed down kind of more, modernist or, I guess kind of more kind of nowish, faddish artistic methodologies as opposed to traditional forms. Do you think education has a place, and is there anything we can do in that space?
Yes, well, I mean, the question of the canon is a big thing. I think obviously, that's a discussion for another day. But when I wrote my book Culture War, I included a couple of quotes. And Sarah Phillips, designer of the new art history, because there was a stage where the art history syllabus for A-level was abolished because they were going to stop A-level art history, and then they brought it back again, and you wonder if that was a good thing. So the designer of the new syllabus says it is a global specification. Students won't just study the work of dead white men; they will have an opportunity to study Islamic architecture and work by men and women of all colours and creeds. And Jeremy Deller, one of our quotes leading artists, said, "Art history is the study of power, politics, identity, and humanity. It makes perfect sense to keep the exam." So that shows you how even art history has become a site of ideological control. I think, I don't think we should get too deeply into the canon, but I would say that in terms of actually creating artists, I think that artists we're going to hit a wall soon, that there's been such an oversupply of artists that we're going to see a reduction of number of art students because there simply isn't enough demand. And also what you're getting for your money, £9,000 a year tuition fee, is very little because you're not being taught almost anything. It's all self-directed. You're just sort of chatting to various tutors who are sort of like directing you and giving you ideas, but they're not giving you any instruction. They're not giving you any training. Most traditional aspects, you can get technicians to do stuff for you, but you don't actually learn the stuff. So I think that what's going to happen is we're going to have fewer art students, more people going to traditional schools, or to schools at least where they teach you the craft and they get you more deeply invested in materials and so forth. Because I think that universities themselves are becoming less and less appealing the more ideologically captured they become.
Mm. Interestingly, there's something I brought up in one of my previous videos where C.S. Ashby wrote a book in 1910 saying we should stop teaching art at university. And one of his big things was the whole point of it, what's happening at universities that are teaching art is that they're just producing other art teachers. And so he was looking, and he said like 70% of the art students then went on to teach. creating this kind of endless cycle of teachers and no actual growth. And I guess if you look at the history of the artist, it's always been more apprenticeship, more kind of personal craft focused, as opposed to this state sanctioned top down. It's always been more bottom up approach to learning and personal self discovery, as opposed to you're almost put in this little cubicle. Here's your state issued syllabus, and at the end of it you get your piece of paper which says you're an artist, as opposed to being an artist is a living thing, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that art education, it's a big subject. I think that universities and fine art are not a good fit, but obviously there's various historical reasons why this has come about, that universities absorbed the art schools. This happened in Britain in 1991, 1992, when we changed over from having a polytechnic system and a university system to just having a university system. The polytechnic system finished. A lot of applied arts and trainings and vocational training ended, which was an absolute disaster. Just educationally, we need people who are technicians, people who have vocational training. We don't need everyone with academic training. We don't need everyone with university degrees. And so the art schools were part of that, and they were absorbed into the university system. And we've been suffering. We were suffering before then, but we're suffering even more now since. And then we've had a proliferation of art courses as well. And it's become so devalued that I see a great contraction in art education in the coming sort of 5-10 years.
Interesting.
I'd just like to add before we end, in regards to the Benedict option kind of area of things. I think that if people who kind of want to still revere kind of more traditional art styles or art forms, or just want refuge from the left, should form kind of like small private societies. And by small, I really mean small. I mean, like 4, 10, 20 people, because the larger it gets, the easier it is for the left to take it down, to kind of start slamming it. And the other thing is, I would advise you to focus on educating yourself culturally and philosophically. Read, study the Greek classics, study the older masters, study all these things that not even that long ago would have been, it would be unthinkable that these things wouldn't have been taught to you, even in, the lowest level of education in the West, in those areas. And because that way, that if your group is kind of forced apart for whatever reason, or it's infiltrated or whatever, you can simply retreat. You can just remain a properly educated, thinking individual without the need of a kind of external support group. And I think the kind of a great advantage of nowadays is that you can form almost a kind of intellectual monastery without even having to, you don't even need a physical space. It can exist entirely online, or in a kind of virtual space perhaps. So that is what I would recommend. Don't do nothing. Just improve yourself. Study these things. Don't let them be taken for granted. The fact that the institutions have been captured should be spurring people on to really, as I don't want to sound like a stuck record, but really educate themselves. Don't take these things for granted.
You're a cultural survivalist, and I approve.
Basically, yeah. I don't see any other option.
Yeah.
I think on that one thing that's interesting is that again, even if you don't consider yourself to be a creative or artistic person, just like Panama said, if you go back to Victorian times, everyone was taught like that. It was more of a kind of everyone's trying to be an erudite, basically. You would know your classics, you would know art, and even if you did end up working as kind of head of the bank, that wealth of experience and knowledge made you a better, more rounded person. But also importantly, as those people would then go on to be patrons as well, and the patrons do have value and can steer artistic power and culture. So I think it's interesting that's something you mentioned, Alex, about something potentially coming back. But we need artists who are thinking the right way. We also need those patrons as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, guys, I think that was a really interesting dive into Iconoclasm, where we're at. So I just want to say a big thank you to Alex and Panama. I don't know, Alex, do you want to just go through your kind of things you're up to and plug any websites again?
Yep. Well, thanks again for the stream. It was great fun to be with both of you. So the best way to follow me is to go to my website, AlexanderAdamsArt.wordpress.com. You can also see my art and my books on AlexanderAdams.art. You can find my books, principally Culture War, which is available now, which I think is very relevant to our discussion. You can find that on all book-selling websites. And yes, keep an eye open for my articles in Spiked Online, The Critic, and also the Jackdaw.
Great. Panama?
As I said at the start, at the moment there is my channel and my Twitter, on which I retweet far too many things. And in the future, I will promote some books and some poetry collections that will likely come out, probably looking at with things as they are next year now. But when they do come out, I will plug them.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you very much. Goodbye.
Goodbye.
Bye.